Round 1. Sue! I tried. Fighter's History was an arcade title released by Data East in 1993 to capitalize on the fighting game craze that got popular with the release of Street Fighter II. Apparently the game was so on the nose with its alleged imitation of the popular fighting game that Capcom sued Data East for infringement and outright plagiarism. The case ended up being a total bust for Capcom because while Fighter's History may copy certain elements from Street Fighter II, there are elements that are entirely generic like certain fighting styles and moves, and thus could not actually be copyrighted, or something to that extent. The story of Fighter's History and the legal wrangling between Capcom and Data East is pretty fascinating stuff, and honestly, is actually more interesting than the game itself. Fighter's History may have gotten some mileage as a result of the case, maybe even a follow-up or two, but after that it sort of went away and was promptly forgotten about until a decade or so later when we needed retro fodder to fill downloadable virtual consoles in eShops everywhere, or again, something to that extent. But we're jumping ahead here. So like any marginally popular arcade game, or really any arcade game for that matter, about a year later, Fighter's History got a home conversion onto the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and that SNES port eventually made its way to Nintendo Classics SNES service, which is what we're using today. Although at one point you could have gotten the arcade Fighter's History via the Johnny Turbo series of downloadables before its eventual scrubbing in 2023, and fortunately I was able to snag said game before then, which... Okay, let me be honest and say that I only bought 2 of these Johnny Turbo things, Fighter's History and Bad Dudes, and they suck. Not so much the games, those are fine, I guess. But the front end on these things were largely terrible, you couldn't remap your button bindings, so if they do bring these things back, maybe design a better front end that doesn't make me wish I was playing these on MAME instead. Or just give it to the hamster people, those rodents do good work with their arcade titles. Much appreciated, thank you. Anyway, I digress. So the game gives you 9 playable fighters to choose from, almost all of them somewhat stereotypical designs and also somewhat derivative of that other fighting game people know and love, as well as a couple other places if you have a keen enough eye. You have a couple modes of play, CPU Battle, aka your usual arcade mode where you fight all the other fighters before facing off against the 2 bosses, a clown and one-time Data East mascot Karnov. And aside from the usual 2-player versus mode, you also have Survival Mode, which you assume would be the usual survival mode type where you outlast a parade of foes until your eventual defeat, but no, it's actually a group battle mode where you and either the CPU or a second player assemble teams of 5 fighters to battle in elimination rounds, with the last team standing win. You can even set it so that both sides are computer controlled and just be a spectator to all this fine action. Much like Street Fighter II, you have a 6-button control scheme comprising 3 buttons and 3 kicks. Each fighter has an array of special moves that you can execute with the usual joystick button combinations. Beat your opponent in 2 rounds to win the fight. You know, the usual fighting game shenanigans that we're all fairly familiar with by this point. Fighter's History does have one unique feature in the form of a weak point system. Each character has a weak point that, when struck enough times, will start to flash. This is usually some piece of clothing, a headband, a chest piece, or even a logo on a t-shirt. After several strikes, the weak point is exposed via removal of clothing, and the fighter is dizzied for a bit. From there, further strikes onto the exposed weak point results in greater damage being done to the fighter, though by the time you get to that point, chances are the fight is on the verge of concluding, so it's a neat idea, makes the game somewhat unique, which is not something I'd associate with Fighter's History all that much. To its credit, Fighter's History is a competent enough fighting game that plays well enough. Controls are fairly solid and responsive, it's easy to pull off some moves once you figure out how to do them, though any movement involving a quarter circle downwards is a bit tricky to pull off, but it is doable. And the weak point system, while a largely inconsequential feature most of the time, is at least something to spice things up a bit. Compared to some of the other fighting dreck that grace Super Nintendo, Fighter's History is at the very least playable and possibly even enjoyable to a certain degree. That having been said, the game does boast that feeling of "Mom, can we play Street Fighter at the arcade? Oh honey, we have Street Fighter at home and this is it." It's the common issue of a game reminding me of another game I'd much rather be playing right now, which is almost always never a good sign. And even by the time Fighter's history graced Super Nintendo in 1994, the console was already up to Super Street Fighter II, which is a far superior offering to Data East's game, which had fewer fighters, played a touch slower, and is lacking in the originality department. But if you set that all aside, Fighter's history is more than adequate fighting fare, and that's more than what you could say about a fair number of fighters to grace the system. Graphically, Fighter's history is a fine-looking game for the most part. In terms of making the transition from arcade to home, there's the obvious loss of detail and other notable downgrades, but nothing too drastic, I feel. The characters are a bit smallish and lacking in size, and the animation isn't the smoothest thing around, but they look fairly decent regardless. The backdrops are also nice looking, if not a bit generic looking. There's some minor animations and activities in the background, so it's not completely static. Generally, it's a pretty good looking fighter. Not great, but it's still nice looking. Meanwhile, in the sound department, you've got a collection of some rather average sounding musical bits that don't sound all that worse than the home conversion. Compared to some other B or C level fighting fare on the console, Fighter's history at least has a soundtrack that feels complete and fleshed out, save for a couple choice tracks that feel a bit, not so much. There's some variety in there, but none of it really sticks after a while. Sound effects are fine for the most part, all the punching and impact sound nice and crunchy. The vocal bits, however, have a bit of an echoey effect that's rather noticeable, but not really terrible otherwise. Overall, Fighter's history is a perfectly acceptable fighting game fodder that feels a bit too much like bootleg Street Fighter to really stand out, and that's really all you could say about the game. To be fair, it did get a follow-up in the form of Karnoff's Revenge, aka Fighter's History Dynamite, as well as a Super Famicom exclusive release featuring Ryu knockoff guy Mizuguchi. But that's about as far as the series has gotten beyond some bit parts and cameos here and there. I mean, the game itself is just fine. Again, in terms of SNES fighting game offerings, it's on the higher end of the spectrum. So it's not a total dumpster fire the likes of Street Combat or Doomsday Warrior, just not that high up there with the likes of Turtles Tournament Fighters, Power Rangers Fighting Edition, or some of the SNK ports that aren't total garbage. It's a fun game, it has its moments, and it does what it does well enough. But what it does has been done better elsewhere, even within the constraints of Super Nintendo. Either way, if you have NSO or Nintendo Classics or whatever they're calling this, it's worth a shot. You could do much worse.